Pokemon is in its 9th generation. That is pretty crazy to think about. We've been forcing cute little monsters to fight each other since 1996, and it shows no sign of stopping anytime soon.
Is that all you got? Go Magikarp! More?
How many gaming franchises can you name that have spanned this many generations of players? It appeals to everyone. Kids, teens, adults. That just doesn't happen. At least not to the level that it's happened with Pokemon. I love this franchise, and I've played every generation for countless hours, so I'm gonna rank them all from worst to best. If you get nostalgic about Pokemon like most people do, then you're probably gonna get mad here, because I'm not taking nostalgia into account. If I was, Gen 2 would be number 1. And it isn't. I'm not talking about spin-offs like Mystery Dungeon and stuff like that, but I will talk about spin-offs that still play like a regular Pokemon game. You'll see what I mean. And this is all just my opinion, so don't feel like you have to agree with me. One of the coolest things about this franchise is that it is so varied, so everyone has completely different opinions on every little thing. But anyway, let's do this. In 9th place is Generation 1. Can we please stop saying that Gen 1 is the best? I am convinced that nobody actually thinks this way. Well, it's the original, so it has to be the best, is such a weird take. The subsequent generations were made to improve upon the first generation. There's just not a lot to dive too deep into, and the story is practically non-existent. Seriously, go back and play these. They're still fun if you're a super fan like me, but they just simply don't have much to offer other than nostalgic value. The controls are clunky, the bugs are seemingly endless. If you're playing anything other than Yellow version, the sprites are questionable. Yes, I know that these were made before the official designs based on the anime, but seriously, look at this. What is this? And don't even get me started on... I will say Pokemon Stadium is pretty cool, but that doesn't really change my opinion on the generation as a whole. It's like a side thing that doesn't really add much besides some cool challenges, mini-games.
This is the greatest thing I have ever seen in my life!
And of course, 3D models. The Gen 1 games were revolutionary. They're the foundation of the largest media franchise in the world, period. You should never undervalue the impact and importance of Generation 1, but let's be honest with ourselves, they just aren't that fun to play. In 8th place is Generation 6. This gen was just so boring. X and Y are painfully easy. None of the Elite Four even have more than 4 Pokemon. Like, come on.
Little baby man, little baby man.
The presentation of these games is solid, but looking back, these models were just so meh for the most part. It was cool to see the handhelds finally go 3D, but this is still kind of ugly. The story here is also just bleh, kind of forgettable. The villains are obviously evil for the sake of being obviously evil. Like, who seriously thought this dude was gonna be a good guy? And the legendaries just show up out of nowhere, which is pretty disappointing. But the PSS was really cool. How they managed to make every single multiplayer interface worse than this one in every generation after is just... It's just impressive. Also, super training was a great alternative to the classic way of EV training, even if it's much slower and just as monotonous after a while. I always saw EV training as something that only the hardcore experts could even attempt. Nowadays, of course, I know how to EV train, but if not for this simple quality of life change exclusive to this generation, I would have never gotten into competitive Pokemon at all. This generation also included the Gen 3 remakes, and as someone who adores Gen 3, I got a lot out of these. Are they perfect? No. But they are a great addition to this generation as a whole. Also, I realize this is an unpopular opinion, but I really don't like Megas. I used to think these were cool in like a childlike wonder sort of way, but over time, I just think they're kind of lame. Like, a lot of the Pokemon that got Megas are such obvious, bland choices.
Alright, I get it!
A lot of the designs were kind of whatever, and it really turned the game into a huge case of haves versus have-nots. If you didn't have one of the overpowered Megas, then you weren't really a contender. I know that's always the case, there are meta Pokemon every generation, but I really feel like this one limited creativity the most. I'm just really not the biggest fan of Gen 6. It's definitely on the weaker side for me. 7th place is Gen 7. If this was a grade on presentation alone, Gen 7 would be much higher. Alola is beautiful, the variety in the new Pokemon is great, even the menus have great designs and are just fun to look at. I also love the Poképelago. I don't know if I was the only person to ever use it, but I enjoyed it a lot. It was the only way to farm important berries, and it actually made it kind of enjoyable to do so. I kind of missed this as an everyday chore. It had a nice vibe. Now, of course, everyone knows that the Festival Plaza was terrible, so online play was kind of meh in this one.
Basically, what you can do here is nothing of any value.
It was so slow, so clunky, and getting the actual plaza itself set up was so overly complicated, and half of the buildings you could get were useless anyway. Now, one big, really good thing that this generation introduced is bottle caps, which are amazing. The Pokemon that I could never use because their IVs were bad were finally able to become viable, and that was super important to me. Back to the bad though, this story is just it's way too long. And it's too long because there's way too much text, and I kinda just wanted to get it over with by the time I was getting towards the end. And that goes for both the main games and their sequels. Also, I applaud them for trying something different, but trials are just not as cool as gyms. They don't have the same level of satisfaction, but I will say that the difficulty on some of them was a nice change of pace. But speaking of difficulty, bring back the battle tree, or at least something like it. Seriously, and make it co-op again. The battle tree was so much fun, even if it was a little bare bones. It didn't matter, because it was co-op, and that made it so much more fun. Z moves were a fun addition, but they definitely did not do competitive any favors, especially since this generation also included Megas. Having both was just insane. You could have an incredibly overpowered Mega and a free nuke on standby. Megas really overshadowed Z moves, and that really sucks. As far as remakes, Gen 7 got Gen 1 remakes. Again, I do think the Let's Go games were really fun and gave new life to the Gen 1 experience, especially to new players, so I didn't even hate these. Altogether, Gen 7 isn't bad, but it is bogged down by some serious issues. In 6th place is Gen 2. My heart. My poor Gen 2, I'm so sorry. A lot of the same problems with Gen 1 are here, but there's actually a pretty fun little narrative going on. There's more to explore, and everything is just a little more accessible, not to mention easier to look at. The biggest thing about Gen 2 for me is just the presentation. This is definitely more visually appealing in the remakes, but I still always found Gen 2 to just look really nice. It has a really unique sort of ancient vibe to the whole thing that really goes far in making the atmosphere of Johto really enjoyable and immersive. It helps that the sprites aren't nightmare fuel, for the most part. The map also flows much better, but by far the worst thing in Gen 2 is that the level curve in these games is asinine.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
The wild Pokemon are way too low of a level, so it takes forever to grind, but that also does lead to the games being more difficult towards the end, which I kind of appreciate, but then it gets incredibly easy when going through Kanto until you get to Blue. And of course, Red. This by itself makes Gen 2 so unique. You get to battle yourself, and Red is the strongest trainer in all of the games. I think that is just so insane and incredibly cool. Gen 2 didn't add a whole lot overall though. There's barely any new Pokemon, a lot of them are bad, and it seems like these games rely way too heavily on Kanto being included. And that inclusion is awesome in theory, but it's definitely pretty half-baked. Once again, Pokemon Stadium 2, while a cool addition, doesn't really change much for me. If this was just nostalgia, Gen 2 would easily be number 1, but it's at 6. In 5th place is Generation 8. This is the generation I have by far the most to say about. Generation 8 was definitely the most polarizing of all of the gens, for obvious reasons. Right off the bat, Dexit really drags this game down for me. Over time, I've grown to accept it as kind of a creative decision to make each region seem a little different based on what national dex Pokemon you can have, but it's still pretty disappointing to get excited about using a Pokemon you really like, only to discover that you can't.
But I want it now!
I'm not really gonna go too in-depth on the Dexit thing because I already made a video on it. Probably the thing I enjoy about Gen 8 the most is the overall presentation. Sure, the wild area isn't very big, but the DLCs do kind of remedy that. However, to touch on the DLCs a little bit, I do think they're just kind of bare bones. The stories are whatever, the legendaries you get out of them are broken, but the Vitamin Machine and Dynamax adventures are the best things about them. As for the main game, yeah, the gym challenges aren't very hard, but the presentation of being in a massive stadium for each battle makes them fun anyway. Honestly, the presentation, like I said, is the single best thing about this generation in my opinion. Yeah, you got some bad textures, some frame rate issues, some pop-in, but despite all that, I still found this world to be exciting and immersive. The gym challenge aspect really made me feel like I was another trainer in this world, and I can't really say that any other generation has given me that feeling. So I really appreciate Sword and Shield for giving me that. The post-game was pretty lame though. Also, some people hate Dynamax, but I love it. I didn't really like Megas, and Z moves were overshadowed, but Dynamaxing combined them both. Yeah, it was overpowered, but everyone had access to it, and that's important. If you don't like any of the Megas, well, tough, you were screwed. But any Pokemon can Dynamax, and I think that makes it so much more accessible. Which is why I also think that having Gigantamax forms was really lame and pointless. All this leads me to the saving grace of this gen for most people: multiplayer. Not talking about this was stupid, but this game made it so easy to EV train, so easy to egg farm, so easy to hyper train. This is by far the easiest generation to make competitive Pokemon in. Even with just the addition of the mints alone, that would make this generation so much more accessible than any of the ones before it. And in multiplayer, Dynamax is a really cool mechanic for doubles. Not so much singles, but still, it's cool. Gen 8 made multiplayer so accessible, I bet more people got into competitive during this generation than any gen prior. It was just so easy, and the presentation made it that much more fun to play with and against your friends or other trainers competitively. The last thing I want to mention are the other games in this gen.
No. Wait.
Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. I think these games are fine. I think they get way more hate than is deserved.
No.
Yeah, they add nothing to the originals other than a fresh coat of paint. Yes, they should have used Platinum instead of base Diamond and Pearl. But if you ask me, it's still a fine experience. Now the last thing is something that honestly makes me want to rank Gen 8 much higher. Legends Arceus. Legends Arceus is one of my favorite Pokemon experiences I've ever had. I thoroughly enjoyed just about every second of this game. That being said, it has so little to do with the rest of the generation that it doesn't even feel like it's part of Gen 8. It's pretty separate. So therefore, I'm not factoring it into my placement too much, but I do love that game a lot. Gen 8 was the longest generation, and it left quite the impact. Fourth place is Generation 5. Yeah, I know, we're supposed to say that Gen 5 is the best now. I know that's the trendy thing to do. But I just replayed through Black and White 1 and 2, and I just don't get it. They're great, yeah, but like, undisputedly the best ever?
I don't know about all that.
These games have a great story, great difficulty, that even includes a hard mode, which should honestly be standard for all Pokemon games in my opinion. It seriously baffles me that there's no difficulty slider in Pokemon games, or at least like a New Game Plus? Anyway, back to Gen 5, I don't really enjoy the graphics all that much, but they are serviceable. A lot of people say that this game has like the best graphics in the whole franchise? I gotta be joking at this point. Even back then, some of these sprites were distractingly pixelated. The sequels are definitely the definitive experience here, and they would still be if the only difference was the inclusion of the Pokemon World Tournament. Please bring this back, Game Freak. I need it like I need oxygen. Honestly, this is the generation I have the least to say about. There's no remake or anything, but these games are still just solid enough on their own to net them the number 4 spot. In third place is Generation 9. Call it recency bias if you want, but I think Scarlet and Violet is some of the most fun I have ever had in a Pokemon game. And it drives me insane that people are gonna hate this placement and expect it to be at the bottom just because it's the newest one. But anyway, the story in these games is actually pretty compelling, you know, compared to most Pokemon stories. And at least in comparison to the other Pokemon games, except maybe Legends Arceus, the exploration and variety here is simply unmatched. You can complain about the glitches, but I can't really say that any of them really hampered my experience. Sure, the frame drops are tiresome, some of the pop-in is a little ridiculous, the raids are finicky at best, and it takes forever to refresh to find online Terra raids.
Oh my god, that kid is he is moving literally, I think, 5 frames a second.
But the overall presentation really helps me overlook a lot of these flaws. I've brought up presentation a ton in this video, and I just think it's very important to Pokemon in particular. If I don't like what I'm looking at, then this gameplay is kinda gonna get boring. Anyway, ADHD, sorry. Terastallization is a really cool mechanic, and is definitely my favorite gimmick out of all of them. Full stop. It shakes up the gameplay in such a fun way, and honestly, this is the first gimmick that I'm really gonna have a hard time moving on from when the generation is over. I love the characters in this story, they actually feel like real people. For the most part, the free roam is finally an actual open world experience. It really makes you feel like John Pokemon Trainer. The fact that there's still a set path you're supposed to take when it comes to the story is still a little lame. The gyms and other challenges should have scaled with where you are in the story instead of heavily encouraging you to take on certain challenges before others. I also love the Pokemon in this generation. It's probably the gen with the most hits over misses as far as the designs go, at least in my opinion. Also, this is the generation with the best looking models, no contest, which makes sense as the newest games, of course. This gen marks the first time a lot of people even realized many Pokemon actually have fur. Like, did you just think these things were just flesh? But it's cool to actually see it outside of Detective Pikachu. One thing I absolutely love in Gen 9 is the DLC. Both of them are wonderful experiences that I wish I could experience for the first time again, especially the Indigo Disc. Blueberry Academy is such a cool setting, with the terrarium being honestly kinda better than the main game's map. I love that both DLCs flow into one another instead of being separate stories, and I actually got invested into the characters. So yeah, the DLCs really knocked it out of the park for me. As of the time of making this video, Legends Z to A isn't out yet, but this generation has already cemented itself as one of my favorites. Sure, they walked back some things like easy EV training, but that's not really a huge deal breaker for me as somebody who's already pretty good at that stuff anyway. I just really hope Gen 10 is just as good, but improves on the technical issues. In second place is Generation 3. This isn't just nostalgia speaking, despite this being the gen I played the most as a kid. Emerald in particular is just an amazing experience all the way through. It is pretty much the only way to get the complete Gen 3 experience. And I would say Emerald is the one Pokemon game that you could give to somebody who does not play Pokemon and they'll probably get into it. Gen 3 Pokemon are almost all hits. Many of these are more iconic than even most of the Generation 1 Pokemon. Double battles were a great addition, and they've been a staple ever since these games, and speaking of which, this generation had these two bangers. I'm not gonna lie, these are why the generation is ranked this high. Pokemon Coliseum and XD are some of my favorite experiences in Pokemon, period. I can't really explain why I love these so much. The double battles were just somehow way more fun than the regular battles of the main games. The villains were delightfully evil and campy, the Shadow Pokemon gimmick made you feel really good about catching them and purifying them, but the best part is the music. Who gave this man permission to pop off this hard? I don't know, these games are just so much fun and such unique experiences, and they make Gen 3 so much better with their inclusion. What also makes it better are the legendaries. I love the legendaries in this generation. They were when the Pokemon designers truly started getting weird with it. Like, what is this guy? Look at this alien thing. This guy is just a star, but it's perfect. I love him. These games have so much replayability, great gym battles, a smooth difficulty curve that is yet to be matched, and contests. You know, contests don't get enough love. These were just so fun, and honestly, they aren't as fun in the remakes, but they're still enjoyable if you ask me. I haven't even mentioned the Battle Frontier. I didn't take advantage of it too much to be honest, but I always appreciate the inclusion of a competitive-esque post-game. They add a lot to the post-game, and Gen 3 has one of the most beloved post-games for a reason. Gen 3 is just so full of content. There's plenty to explore, these games are just so good and they hold up even to this day. And just to boot, they've got really good remakes of the Gen 1 games, and those are the definitive way to play Gen 1 in my opinion. There's a lot of good reasons why everyone loves Generation 3. And in first place is Generation 4. What can I say that hasn't already been said? Generation 4 was when these games decided to start getting crazy, with the story, the legendaries that are just straight up gods now, the villains that are actually evil instead of just goofball gangster caricatures, or hippies. This generation gave us so many great new Pokemon that are now staples. I mean, this is where Lucario and Garchomp came from, and I know a lot of people will immediately put this gen at the top based on those two alone. Especially Lucario. People have molded their whole personality around this one Pokemon. Now that is an impact. The graphics and presentation still hold up even if the snail's pace of this gen doesn't, and that's probably the biggest flaw with these games.
Hurry it up, will ya?
They really are slow, but if that's your biggest problem, then you're doing alright. Okay, well I guess the HMs are pretty bad too, but hey, that's what Bidoof is for. This gen mostly just improves on the previous ones, but the most significant change was the physical and special split. It is not an exaggeration to say that this is the most important thing to ever be added to Pokemon, period. There is no debate. Without this change, Pokemon isn't the juggernaut it is now. This changed the entire game. It's not just a simple monster game for kids anymore. There's actually a fun competitive aspect that isn't being ruined by god-awful type balancing. This alone would rank this gen higher than most, but Gen 4 goes above and beyond in every aspect. I haven't even talked about the best part of this generation yet though. Heart Gold and Soul Silver. If you ask me what my favorite generation is, counting remakes as part of the original generation, it's Gen 2, and it's because of these. This is the definitive Gen 2 experience that includes everything that already makes Gen 4 great as is. Sure, the level curve is still stupid, but other than that, everything that held back Gen 2 from being great is just not here. And on top of that, you also have Battle Revolution. This was really fun, but it doesn't really add much. But not adding much to a generation that is already this good is hardly a problem. Generation 4 is the single most revolutionary gen of this entire franchise. It has aged like wine, something that really can't be said for most generations. Have you tried to go back to Gen 7 lately? It's kind of miserable. You can tell these games were labored over. They are the benchmark. They are why Pokemon is the lasting powerhouse it is today. The visuals are timeless. The music is timeless. The characters are timeless. While it's maybe not my personal favorite generation, I don't think there's any other placement I could put it at. I think it's safe to say that Generation 4 is the single best Pokemon generation. But the Great Marsh is still really bad.